Chris Ott, tell the listeners who you are and what you do.
My name's Chris Ott. I'm a music writer, critic, whatever you want to say. In my former life, I guess. I still do the odd podcast. I've just been around in the margins. Basically, I was like you, I was someone that was there early on, especially when I was with Pitchfork, and then kind of built my own thing for a while. And then after that, the whole music Twitter period, which ended up being not a great experience. So the last 10 years, well, let's say the last 5 years, have been sort of going down the ladder of adulthood and having growing children. And so a lot of the, I don't want to say requirements, but a lot of what goes on online is increasingly sort of foreign to me. So it's good and bad. Like I get to pick my spots, but then I'm not also like in the mix. And increasingly, obviously lots of people don't have any idea who I am or what.
Right. And these days, like a lot of the stuff you do, you work with video a lot and streaming. You mess around a lot with like Discord. I think you're actually a couple steps ahead of a lot of people.
Yeah, I did. So I had all these. There was a lot of fallout when I quit Twitter. There was some really annoying stuff that happened with my identity being stolen and just all kinds of nonsense. But so I just kind of went away for a couple of years. And then right before COVID, someone was telling me, it was actually a little bit before COVID, that Discord was really taking off and that there were pretty significant communities. So I started a Discord. And we got up to, it was under 500 people, but it was humming pretty good. And like people were making limited edition t-shirts and sending them all to each other. We were doing movie nights. Like it was really fun. And I knew a lot of these people over the years who had been kind of lifer, I don't want to say fans, but people who liked what I had to say, back to the, DSLR videos I did 10 years ago on YouTube. And the Discord was really cool. It was a really cool central hub. And that ran for about a year. And I started doing YouTube live streams when COVID broke out in, I think it was mostly April and May of 2020. And, and that was cool too in its own way.
And in those, you were kind of doing like histories, I guess, like improvisational histories. You're kind of using a prompt and moving from there.
Yeah, it started out like I literally would go down in the basement with like 4 pints of Guinness and spend an hour and a half just pulling records out of my shelves, just because I felt like there was this community. It's not a huge community, but people I had been around and stuff who were like getting sick of Twitter for the same reasons I had. And so it was just like a hangout thing. But then gradually I started thinking about it. And I started doing more pointed things I was calling Chart Sweep, which is a evolution control committee maxi MP3 they put out back in the early MP3 days, where they played like 10 seconds of every top 10 hit since 1950 or whatever in one song. I don't know if you remember that, but I stole the name from that. And I
remember
just
something called Introspection. I don't think that was them though.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
That was like a similar concept where it was just kind of like the intros of a bunch of songs, and it was kind of artfully put together. That was probably around like 2002, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it was all around. Yeah, it's like pre too many DJs, pre, DJ Kicks era.
Right. I mean, if you remember like the boom selection thing, they ended up putting out like a multiple CDR thing that just kind of collected a bunch of MP3s.
Totally. Yep.
But yeah, that's in there. That's actually the first thing I ever wrote about semi-professionally. I think where I was writing for someone else's thing.
I think I have the folder of MP3s that you put out on that blog post on a hard drive, like Boom Select, all that stuff. I still have like just hot dump folders and old drives where I saved all that stuff. That was the crazy Audio Galaxy days, right? But just to finish up, so I did like year by year analysis, right? I would just pick a year and I would literally read the chart and goof and remember things from when I was a kid. It was really personal more than critical. And again, this was during like the complete blackout panic at the start of COVID, so it had a very different vibe. But then gradually I started doing these, more analytic critical things, and I did one on IDM and one on pop punk and really just 90s punk, and it just started kind of coming back at me, like the noise of being out there again. And, look, I've said it a million times, like my 2 oldest kids are going to be teenagers here in a minute. And so I have a very different, kind of like thermometer or temperature when it comes to what's going on with having your name out there anymore. So it runs hot and cold for that reason. And as much as, unfortunately having been targeted by some people that I pissed off or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, well, the thing that came to mind when you were talking about it, like, oh, it's a small community. It's like 500 people. And I think that that's kind of where we're kind of headed back to after the past, let's say 10 years or so of mass social media, that the idea of like communities don't need to scale.
Yeah.
Communities can be perfectly fine without having to be like every person conceivable, like be able to just kind of stumble into it. Like having communities that are just like really focused, that are, I think those are ultimately more valuable. And like, I think when people go to social media, that's what they want. It just happens to be in the same space as everything else. So
Yeah.
I think that's kind of where like Discord really points towards like the best elements of it, of message boards, of Slack, of a lot of things, and kind of puts it all together into something I think can be helpful in the future. And maybe it won't be them who win this, but I think that that's the shape of things to come.
I totally agree. And I mentioned in passing the music Twitter period, and there was so much false amplification and like ratio. I mean, I was right in the middle of it, and it was we knew that magazines were buying tons of bot farms. So, like as a joke, a bunch of different people bought bots, like just because it was like you don't like every writer in every publication had 12 to 15,000 followers, and it didn't scan, like none of it scanned in terms of the data footprint of what was going on, but it created this false pressure, like exactly what you're talking about, where it seemed like this was this big world. But in reality, and I've said this in a number of videos and stuff, look at, there's ways you can figure out the size of this whole thing in terms of really obsessive kind of people where endorphins get fired talking about music or having 4,000 CDs. I personally, it's barely six figures. I just don't think it's as big a world as maybe a lot of people who came to it during that period perceived.
Yeah. And I think that there's, well, why did we feel that music writing, music media could scale in that way? And I think, okay, one, you have MTV, but MTV and radio are different beasts. They're passive things. They're not writing. But like the magazines, like even in the boom, I think like the 90s is a particular big magazine boom for sales.
The Entertainment Weekly period, dude, that was nuts. I was at Time Inc. then. That's when I worked at Time Inc.
Yeah, I mean, I have been collecting a lot of Rolling Stones and Spins from that era, and yeah, it's like Spin was a magazine that had like real power. It certainly had real power over me when I was a teenager, because I just look at these magazines and I just reverse engineer, like, oh, that's why I got that. That's why I bought that's why I had like 4 Stereo Lab CDs before I graduated high school.
Yeah,
there's no other reason why that would happen. But yeah, so you get this illusion that things could sell, and a lot of things that magazines and newspapers could do, especially the more adventurous stuff or the more interesting stuff, like you cannot do them in the age of internet, because back then you couldn't see that your audience didn't care about those pages.
The thing I
this
think
wasn't
about,
transparent.
yeah, it wasn't. The thing I think about when you mention Spin is like, in the Byron Coley days when it started, they went out and got people who were like had huge cred in the zine scenes.
I mean, if you look at the ones in the 80s, there's like several columns to underground music, not just one, but several.
Yep. And they had Jim Greer, and Jim Greer was the big one in the 90s. And, look, that guy single-handedly breaks Guided by Voices, Pavement probably too. They reviewed the Perfect Sound Forever 10-inch in Spin. Like, I remember them talking about the slanted tape, which was going around for like 8 months before the album came out. I had a copy, and the buzz around Pavement was hugely built in the same way that later Pitchfork would do for lots of bands, through the journalists doing that kind of, crowbarring it in there and getting it in the magazine. And that goes, like, without getting too far down the rabbit hole, think of the way all the UK trades ran. I've talked to Simon Reynolds a number of different times privately, and we did a podcast. Those journalists were they had huge control over what would get lobbied for. And the bands were like pissed about it. So it's a weird interplay between roles, and the whole thing, to come full circle, was driven by the fact that there was money because there was physical media. And
Yeah.
once that goes away, all there is advertising, and it just totally changed everything.
Yeah. Well, I think when thinking about something like Discord, which is, that's more like a message board than it is a publication, obviously. I mean, it basically is a message board, just run with different software. Um, I think that the potential there is to kind of get back to something like I Love Music, the ILX days, where,
Oh boy.
and I think like that's I'm sure there's other consequential music message boards and things like that, but that one I think has a really long tail in terms of the sheer volume of people who were either working music journalists or people who became working music journalists, people who were musicians and had like who ended up having some kind of career, like John Darnielle being probably the biggest example. um I think there's more potential for that, and like that was not a thing that needed to scale. That was about as big as it was going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I'd take the other side of that question too, which is that, where do we have something that unifies these pockets of 300 to 500 person discords? Does everything have to be a self brand? Look at Substack. This is the big argument about Substack and Substack Pro or whatever they're calling it. There's a lot of noise right now around that whole, is that an elitist thing? Where are the controls? Who gets extended these offers? The concept, there's two concepts that come out of this. One is the audience feeling that they're a stakeholder and that they have a say in what these platforms become and how they evolve, which makes very little sense to me, but that's a whole other conversation. But as you said, it's the idea that the Discords and the Reddit subs too, right? Indie Heads is probably
Yeah.
the biggest thing. These are communities that don't want to scale. And where's that come from? Is it naturally a number of people, like there's just that many people interested, or is there a self-policing kind of thing? Because when you think about, like, they don't have nearly the impact they used to, but like when 4chan and Moo became really big during the whole heyday of like when Whir blew up and Death Consciousness and all that weird suburban like Ang Lee kids, like they were so intense and emo. These communities, like, are they just naturally of a certain size, or are they self-policing, and is there some kind of elitism? I can't say.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think the ideal thing is like these scenes that happen on message boards, on discords, whatever. They're basically simulations of things that happen in real life, and these things don't happen in real life the way they used to. They did migrate over into these different forms in ways that are good and bad. But I think it's people have to know each other. I think it's like something that gets really lost in the shuffle.
100%.
Artists need to talk to each other, writers need to talk to each other, artists and writers, and all these people. Like the more that they're all kind of like in communication with each other, either like literally or figuratively, the better it is.
Think about the Chicago boom, right? Pitchfork's part of the Chicago boom. All these people live in apartments together. They got to make rent. They got to figure out how to get a ride to go to a show. You're compelled to be a physically present and trustworthy person because of that. And local scenes, physically present scenes where people go to shows. Obviously, COVID makes this a million times more messed up, but there's social rules there. Like, you can't screw around or behave inappropriate. Like, you're going to get self-copped by the other people in that scene.
Well,
And
I
I
mean,
saw that.
obviously, there's situations where like people act horribly rampantly for years and then it catches up with them, like that burger scene, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of weird stuff, and it's funny too because some of it gets cheered for. Like, look at the way people lionize Cokies and the whole like cocaine, like shitty stepped on coke subculture in Alphabet City around the time of the Strokes and Interpol and LCD Sound System. I mean, we've talked before about how over celebrated that moment continues to be. But it's also about the fact that, like, yeah, where are the receipts? Like, what's the narrative? Is there any correcting for it? Or are we going to continue to celebrate decadence on the one hand and then, go nuts on the other hand for the same excesses? It's a weird line. I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, and people like a story. I think that's like, the early aughts thing with the Strokes and that. And then like I just finished and put out the 77 to 79 punk thing. And like they're just really good stories. Like they're really good images. That like it makes sense why people like get really hung up on them and why those stories get told over and over again. And like one of the things you really see in punk is that from day one, from even before day one, people are self mythologizing.
Oh, totally. I just got the Iggy Bowie years box set in the mail, and it's funny. I was going back and forth with Nick Sylvester, who you got such a great episode with, or two episodes. Um, and my favorite song in this whole period is not, generally speaking, considered one of the killer cuts, which is Some Weird Sin. Um, I don't know what it was. There's something about the guitar tone in Some Weird Sin that just has stuck with me and is as transportive now as it was when I was like a teenager and I first heard it. And I heard it because I was told that Ian Curtis was listening to it when he committed suicide, which is, talk about myth making, right? Like, yeah. So Iggy was like doing shows all throughout this period while he's the godfather of punk. There's a lot of famous magazine covers and stuff around that time, but he's in this different place, so deep into his career. But it's true. You're right. They were teeing up, the fake name thing. Oh no, we have to use fake names or else they'll find out that we're also on the dole. Kinda. I don't know about that.
In the United States, and speaking to Iggy too, like what the thing really, I mean, the perfect example of what I mean about like the mythology was there from day one, before day one, was on the playlist I had that's before punk 72 to 76, song from really at the end of that run, by Wayne County and the Backstreet Boys. Not those Backstreet Boys.
Yeah.
The song Max's Kansas City, which is really just Wayne County, who became Jane County later on, just telling you how cool Max's Kansas City is and like talking about all the bands that play there and what they're doing, the antics. Hey, there's Lou Reed and Iggy Pop hanging out. What are they going to do? Like this. It's basically the energy that people will be tapping into for years to come. And like he lists off all the bands, and like 75% of them are like some of the most famous and beloved bands in the world. And it's just really funny to think about this song in terms of, would anyone do this song later on? Because to do this song at that point in time, I mean, made a good bet, but it probably was kind of seen as like, oh, this is a stupid song. But imagine, like, I mean, did anyone in Olympia, Washington do this in like 1991? Did anyone, name me a scene and like, did anyone do a song like that about how cool the scene is and like listing off all the bands and how much everybody ruled, even the bands who sucked?
Yeah, I mean, it's because Losing My Edge and like the Dead Milkmen's You'll Dance to Anything are the opposite thing. Yeah, exactly.
Those are hater songs.
Right. And those are
the LCD, that's not like a hater song, but that's definitely a song where it's about, I mean, I feel like that's always been like a really funny way to open his career, where he's coming in, he's, in his, I think by that point, he's probably like 32 or 33. He probably felt much older than he was. And, coming in with like, hey, I'm washed up, like I think like that was a good way of framing him in a kind of a self-deprecating way.
Yeah, I saw him a couple times in the Sound System period, the pianos period, and I think that at the time I was like, okay, he's leading with his insecurity. He feels like he can't do what he wants to do because he's not good enough. He's not he's not like, and I'm sort of okay with this because this is a really cerebral guy, and I have faith that he's going to like arrive at something that isn't so vexed and enervating and just kind of, pinned in by his own insecurity. And for me, what that is not the commercial breakouts he had. Although, Daft Punk is Playing at My House is one of my all-time favorite cuts, but it's that Nike thing, the 45-33 piece.
Oh, yeah.
That thing blew my mind. I still hold that up as probably one of the most substantial, musical creations to come out of that whole period.
Right. And that includes like the original instrumental stuff from Someone Great.
Yep,
Yeah.
totally. And it just evolves. It's so gorgeous. You know, I think back to like Chick Chick Chick. I mean, that was another band that's gotten lost. I think back to like their first record. I saw them in Boston, and Nick Offer came off stage and just grabbed me and started like grinding me. Like, dude, he would be so canceled today if that show was like, he came out and he grabbed my ass and started grinding his crotch against my crotch. And I was like, fuck yeah, dude. Like, we should be dancing. Like, this shit is so uptight. Everyone's just wearing white belts and doing, you know, bad emo stuff. And I thought they were such a breath of fresh air. I know. And I mean, I was all for that. I mean, yes, the dance punk thing got completely out of control, as we know, but I really thought they were incredible. And obviously Warp Records did, because they just continued to back them, you know, way past their like, you know, blossoming hip phase.
Yeah. You know, the last time I saw Chick Chick Chick, they were actually opening up for themselves as a Stereolab cover band.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that. And I loved Outhood too, the Street Dad record. Like, you know, again, it's hard to filter in a way that's, you know, if you're the filter, then it becomes a lot about your persona and like what you're known for repping for and stuff. But I love those guys. I think they're a major through line for exactly what LCD was. And I just don't think they get enough credit, weirdly. Even though they've played huge festivals and like are probably fine.
Yeah, I kind of get the sense that some of that stuff will probably. I think things are, you know, there's always kind of like this period of time where things are kind of like not as celebrated, and then people kind of like, you know, enough time passes that you're a legend, you know?
Yeah. Well, American football, right? American football is the big one. And when all these people were talking about math rock, you know, I made a video about that. It's not online anymore. I'm trying to get people to stop putting my videos on YouTube because of, again, having kids and stuff. It's just weird because they're old and it is a different place in my life. But the point I make there is like, whoa, wait a minute. This is not math rock. Like, what are you talking? And when you talk about bands that just get forgotten, the band I bring up in that video is Heavy Vegetable, which was like pure math, like lunacy. And that's Rob Crow, who ends up making a bigger name, you know, with different projects like Pinback. But yeah, to your point, it's like what gets bubbled up and what gets seized on as being, you know, canon, that even that is mutable, you know, now in the internet age.
Yeah. I think there's also a thing where it's like, I feel like this is a thing that no one ever really wants to address, is that there's certain like musical things that kind of live on because it's easy or relatively easy for new musicians to ape the sound. And so certain sounds kind of will kind of carry on and always be kind of cool because it's the kind of thing that a young band can do pretty well. I mean, it's the way that like there's always going to be stuff that sounds like Joy Division. But I was listening yesterday to like Matador just started doing a podcast where they just have their own musicians talk to each other. And like, so the first episode they had was Liz Phair, Mary Timony, and the girl from Snail Mail, Lindsay something.
I thought Snail Mail and Liz Phair did that like 2 years ago.
Oh yeah, I mean, like those three have all definitely talked to each other many times.
Okay,
but,
I haven't seen this because Mary Timony was like right in the middle of my post college. I worked at Fort Apache. Brian, her bass player, it was like the engineer teaching me about studio and stuff. And yeah, she's so great. I'm so glad her. And I should also mention Shauna Carmody from Swirlies is also doing a podcast and has been for a while that people should check out. But I haven't heard this conversation with Snail Mail, but go ahead.
It's really good. So like, I mean, and Mary, I think, comes off particularly well in it. Like Mary's very a very interesting person, and she's much more low key than the other two. And I think the major reason like they were talking was because Mary's first solo album was reissued, and that was like the peg.
Oh, okay.
So what I was getting at is there's one part towards the end of it where they're both kind of like amazed that the Snail Mail girl arrived at the music that she was making when she was, you know, still like a teenager, without having really listened to any of this old college rock, etc. You know, all this old indie music. and they just were completely mystified by it. And I'm just sitting there screaming in my head. It's like, this is just the music that, if you just have like someone with like, rudimentary guitar skills, like this is kind of one of those things that they'll just kind of naturally happen. Like that's what happened with those bands in the first place. I don't think you need to have actually heard any of that music to end up making music that sounds like it.
No, because Liz Phair and Mary Timony and Helium are out there. And the artists, I think of just what you were saying is, and I apologize, I don't know exactly how to say this, but Bia Do Bibi, the girl in England.
Biba Doobie.
Biba Doobie. Okay. So Biba Doobie, if you look at, listen, I only got into this because my daughter listens to Clairo and all this stuff. And like, I'm not telling her what to listen to. She listens to Lana Del Rey and things that I've like publicly said I'm not a fan of.
I mean, this is like the music that like, this is kind of the music that's like made for and sold to like girls about the age of your daughter. So
yeah,
it's not even that weird. It's just like, there's nothing to be surprised by. This is like what is made for them. It would be like someone being surprised that I listened to Pearl Jam when I was 13 in 1993. Right.
It's sad girl TikTok is what it is. And like, I totally get it. And I'm very involved in sort of knowing where she's going, what she's doing and who she's talking to. But like, I'm not going to be like rock critic dad.
Oldest daughter?
14. Okay. So, I'm not going to be rock critic dad about it. But when I saw, that girl, what is it? Bia Badoobie?
Doobie.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Anyway,
it's not a great name.
It's not.
I think she's pretty good. She has a few songs I like a lot, but like that name is like, oof. It's amazing how well you're doing being called Biba Doobie.
Yeah. So when I look at Biba Doobie and I look at the YouTubes of her songs, they're like templates of the 90s. There's like a Pavement song. There's a Curve song. There's almost
funny, like the song that's about Stephen Malkmus doesn't really sound like Pavement.
No, it doesn't.
But that's my favorite one by her.
But there's these other ones that sound like, and this is what I hear getting into a lot of the new music is the dance pop stuff. So I hear a lot of Curve. I hear even Ned's Atomic Dustbin and EMF, even like the Stigmatas, not like the Unbelievable period, but I hear that pre-Nirvana utopia, which is something you and I have talked about.
I was listening to like even just specifically Biba Doobie. I was listening because like she just released a new single like a week or so ago. And I was listening, I was like, man, she just goes in on that like 19. I mean, I think it might be a thing. Like, like I don't think you necessarily need to know that music to arrive at that. Especially
no, you don't.
I think you just get like guitar, and if you have the right like pedal or two, you just kind of, if that's something you want to do, you're going to do it. You don't necessarily need to have a doctorate in ride or something.
You don't need to be Martin Hannett to figure out how to sound like Martin Hannett. That's the difference. And you can go on any website and look up the rig and how they got this sound, what synthesizer did they use. So when, and I this is something I wrote so long ago, but I wrote a huge piece about this kind of spinning off of Daniel Lopatin, right? Which is that if all these sounds...
1 Tricks Point Never, right?
Yeah, 1 Tricks Point Never, yeah. He, the way he was working was celebrated for its kind of sonic accuracy in many circles, which is fine. But when you can just click and there's a website that tells you exactly what VST or plugin you got to drop in, and it will immediately sound exactly like X record. Like it's The Cure 17 Seconds, it's Unknown Pleasures, or, whatever you want to talk about. It's Echo and the Bunnymen, all these 80s chorus and flange guitar bands. The ability to just be able to click and have pictures of exactly what settings and what effects pedals you need to put in front of your guitar rig, that's super messed up. And I mentioned Nick earlier. We used to talk about this all the time when his band Mr. Dream was still going strong. And you would just see these bands where it's like, well, that's a $2,500 Jazzmaster. And those pedals, let's add that up. That's about, another $1,000. And the stuff that these bands would be coming out with was like, it was a little bit scary. Like you didn't have to be part of the music scene and young and hungry and talking to record store clerks. You could just form this all in your head. And if you had some money, buy the right gear and sound like whatever you wanted.
Yeah. So from your perspective as a person who's like pretty well acquainted with lots of music equipment, you're a good musician. What are things that are really hard for people to just kind of emulate? Like what would be a good example of like, well, you're not going to easily arrive at that sound?
We were talking about Iggy Pop in the Berlin years because David Bowie's not a natural producer. Some weird saying, try and sound like that. Good luck. One of the big things that you will not hear anyone ever use predominantly is out of phase signals. That creates actual like pain in certain circumstances. Phasing, whether it's in the studio or live or whatever, dumping phase to inversion is a very weird move. It's almost an amusical move, so you don't hear that played with much.
Like,
But I mean,
that's a big part of My Bloody Valentine is the extreme phasing.
exactly. But he's using it in a way that's like academic. Like without being a mathematician, he's setting up inversions that actually have a frequency response. He's massaging that, and he's doing it so that there's space, meaning this frequency is actually canceled by this instrument, so this other instrument can be in that space. It allows you to create the kind of delicacy that you find on that record. That record is not about noise. That record is about the absence of noise in so many ways that's not really well understood, because everyone thinks, oh, only shallow, I'm going to get a Fender blender and 7 other pedals and turn everything up to 10 and it's going to be this wall of sound. It's like, no, that's not at all how he got that.
Yeah. I think like My Bloody Valentine is probably the all-time greatest example of something that people will hear it and they'll be inspired by it and they will not know how it was made, but they can, just by a naive attempt, you can create something good from that. I mean, I think most shoegaze music is basically people who don't know what they're doing, like aiming for something that Kevin Shields was doing on one of, if not that one, I think Isn't Anything as well. But
for sure,
but it's ultimately a naive attempt to do something that the guy who is a lot more thoughtful and a lot more accomplished was doing.
Yeah, and that's how like most of the best bands start. You're trying to, and I've told kids this face on that are trying to start bands and have asked me stuff. I say, just slavishly try and rip off. Excuse me, we should probably not use that word. Just
emulate. Say emulate.
Emulate, yeah. Absolutely emulate and rip off your favorite song, because you're not even going to get close, and it's not going to sound anything like it, but you'll still come away with a song. Don't hide from that.
I think I think this is one of those things that's attributed to John Lennon, but the notion that like originality is basically like trying to do something and not being good enough, and where you land when you're aiming at the thing you can't do.
Yeah. And I mean, look, I'm totally guilty of, I told kids exactly what the effects units are that Kevin Shields used. If you get a MIDI Verb 2 and you can get them used, the prices keep going up. Everyone was buying the wrong rig for a decade, man. Everyone was buying the SPX 90. That's not the right rig. You can get it as the GEP 50. There's another foot stomp unit called the Rex that I have. I gave one of them. I had 2 of them. I gave one to someone else. Because there wasn't an internet and there wasn't a definitive referendum on exactly what the truth was, there was some games of telephone going on with what Kevin's, skeleton key was. But the reality is it's 2 units. There's a Yamaha unit, like I say, the GEP 50 is the cheapest and easiest way to get it. And there's the Alesis MIDI Verb 2, and it's patches 46, 47, 48, and 49. They're called Bloom. And that's it.
Have you ever been able to kind of approximate like To Hear Knows When or something like that on your own? Just trying to go for it?
So in 2007, when I was still living in New York, I booked a week in a studio in Astoria. And I had these demos I've been working on since 2003. While I was, the whole time I was living alone, while my wife and I were living in a pre-war in Hell's Kitchen. And I wrote an album that was basically, originally I was going to call it Another Bullshit My Bloody Valentine Tribute Volume 6. I've sent this album with my tuneless attempts at scratch vocals to so many people over the years, trying to find a singer to maybe finish it one day. But it is exactly that. I'll send you a sample of it if you want to play a snippet.
Yeah.
It's not great, but I very intentionally went in and wrote 10 songs that use all those same effects. And I'm not trying to make them sound exactly the same. My contention was always, what if you took like hardcore rock, post-rock drums, really heavy drums like that band ISIS, right? And put that on My Bloody Valentine, because ISIS had this song called Glisten from the album Celestial that I loved, that was doing sort of that same idea, which is, you think of Boris and Melvins, lots of other bands have sort of traveled the wall of fuzz route with big drums.
So can I ask you a question? In doing that, did you find that kind of combining these two things that you sort of ended up with something that sounded like the Smashing Pumpkins?
Um, I wouldn't say it sounds. It certainly doesn't sound like Gish, like hair metal era Pumpkins. There's no question though that parts of it do have a kind of Siamese Dream aspect to it.
Right. Because I feel like that would almost be like, I could just imagine you accidentally just being, oh, I made Siamese Dream.
Yeah, I mean, there's totally like Cherub Rock stuff. I mean, it's the same producer. He called Mulder and had him. He's like, "You did Loveless? Come do the Siamese Dream for me." He was so in demand after that record; it was unbelievable because everyone wanted the secrets. Um, Everyone wanted the recipes for Blown a Wish and these
Yeah.
incredible soundscapes.
And Flood and as
Yeah,
well. Like,
too
if
as
you
well.
I remember a while ago looking at like, okay, what did Flood do? Let me see just like his old discography in one place. And like, oh, okay, so this is like most of the records I liked between like 1992 and like 2004. Is
And
this like it's just like the sheer volume of classics and or even just like good records that Flood and Alan Moulder have their names attached to, and then like also like they have their own connections to like various Eno records.
yeah, and look at every one of those CDs and what does it say on it? It was a joke, a running joke with all my music nerd friends when we were like 13, 14. Every CD says mastered by Nimbus on it. And it's like, you can't believe it.
I when I worked at BuzzFeed, two of my colleagues there, Alex Natus and Peggy Wang, they were previously in the band The Pains of Being Pure at Heart.
I was
And
going to mention them a minute ago.
right, and they recorded, I guess, their second album with Flood and Alan Moulder, and it always took me like a lot of restraint to just not be like, "Hey, Alex, what's Flood like?" Just derail conversation by just like, just tell me anything about Flood.
Yeah, I hear you, man. It's like, and there's such a never meet your heroes aspect to all this too, because every one of them that I've ever talked to has been like a crushing defeat. And I don't know if it's because you're so naked, you're so exposed, you're such a fanboy. Like when I interviewed Simon Raymond from Cocteau Twins, um, oh my God, my foot was in my mouth the whole time. Every question was a dumber question than the one before it. It was absolutely brutal. And it took getting to the age I am. Like 2 years ago, I interviewed Lowell Tolhurst from The Cure. He's the first member of The Cure that I ever interviewed, despite knowing more about this band than probably any other band. And the hard part there was, I was more seasoned and more mature and less worried about it than when I was 21 interviewing the bassist from the Cocteau Twins. And the interview, unfortunately, he was like totally closed off because he was doing 50 of them, as a press promo for his book. And I had an hour. It took me like half an hour for him to start paying attention almost and being like, wait, how do you know all this different, like, about we knew the specials and all these relationships that I was like, I'm a music critic. Like I did this for decades. And it was tough because he got sort of excited finally. And we had like 20 minutes left and it was the only 20 good minutes where he was like, oh, I remember that. That was so funny. And, I just, at the end of it, I couldn't use any of it, but I just felt like maybe I actually made this guy like smile that day. And that can be what I got out of, 30 years of obsessively listening to his band.
So right before we hit record on this, I was like, oh, we'll use CDs as a starting point.
Yeah.
And here we are, like nearly 40 minutes into this, and we have not. So let's pivot to that. Let's talk about CDs. You mentioned to me that you have been just acquiring lots and lots of CDs just in the past year. I've been doing a similar thing for a little while. I guess maybe like going back 4 years or something like that, because CDs are so cheap now. This is used CDs, even new CDs will just be like really cheap. So, like, what was the initial thing for you there? This going back to CD.
Well, so what I started noticing, and I think anybody will notice, is that songs will come and go on streaming. When the rights change hands, when someone sells their catalog, when Warner Chappell or Cherry Red buys up all the rights for Dinosaur Jr. in the digital world. And this pattern, look, I'm not a tinfoil hat person who's going to go out and buy every CD ever made. But as far as the music that's been important which isn't to say that it's necessarily my favorite, but music that I have an innate response to. Like I see that album cover and I'm like, oh, I remember that. And one of the things I was telling you was funny is a band that I like personally did not like for personal reasons. Death Cab for Cutie. I just bought their whole discography for $8. And it's just because, you know, when I look back at the picture book of my life, it's music. And, you know, I can't stand the fetish vinyl thing. I've always hated that. And so when I started looking on Discogs, because, you know, when COVID hit, we're all staring at computer screens. You know, these CDs are $1.99. And if I buy 10 of them, I get free shipping. So I can spend $40 and get like 27 CDs.
Yeah.
And that was so silly to me that, you know, I looked back and did the accounting before we talked, and I've bought over 700 CDs in the last year. And I think the most I paid for one of them was like an out of print Enya box set. I think I splurged and paid $40 for it.
Right.
But it's
which
like,
is like significantly less than it would have been at the time.
Exactly. And it's just the fact that CDs they've been rejected. I mean, I think this is already starting to turn and kids are realizing that vinyl actually sounds like crap, and it does not, there's no legitimate argument that it's sonically superior to to digitally captured the same master tape. Like,
yeah.
That's so illogical. It's not even worth talking about.
I mean, part of the reason for me, other than it being cheap, is like, I just feel like it's just a better listening experience. Just throw a CD on. You're not flipping sides. I think the flipping sides is hugely overrated. I have tons of vinyl too. There's like, I have lots of artists like they're like, I try to keep discographies consistent. So they're, you know, so I have like all the Pavement, for example. That's like Malcolm and Pavement, all of that stuff. That's all vinyl. So if there's a new thing from him, I get it on that format. But
Yeah.
anyone else, like, no, you're getting your CD. And like, you know, there's also lots of places where you can just go to like, you know, in New York, there's Housing Works. I happen to live like a block away from a Housing Works. So I can pop in there and like the CDs there are $1 a piece.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, you know, and you know, there's lots of stuff you don't want, but you know, I'll pop in there once in a while, and they'll be like, "Oh, I'll take that $1." No, sure thing. And I live in Park Slope, Brooklyn, so like the taste of people who are donating stuff there is pretty decent for the most part.
Yeah, you're ahead of the game there because, well, the other part of this is, so I'm in the burbs, right? And you can find some weird stuff in the burbs. Like the transfer station will have like a sharing place. And I've gotten like really good high quality speakers there for free. And one of the things I got were these incredible tower speakers made by Infinity in the 90s. They were like $4,000 a pair at the time. I got them for $20 at a church fair. And I got a reference receiver amplifier, a Proton amplifier, NAD and Proton. Like if you grew up in the 80s, this is the American Psycho stereo system. Like you have no choice. If you were into music in the 80s, you have a fetish for exactly this kind of stuff, the Bang & Olufsen stuff, right? So I got a Proton receiver off Craigslist for $110. And the other thing that we talked about is I got a Laserdisc player for $50 from a karaoke place that was going out of business, so that I could buy the handful of, you know, weird Laserdiscs that have never been and are unlikely to be put out on the, you know, Blu-ray or DVD.
What's a good example of one of those?
REM Succumbs, baby. I got the Japanese I got the Japanese Laserdisc of REM Succumbs. Now the Laserdiscs are not cheap. This is very targeted purchasing. I'm talking like one a month because they're going to run you $40-$50.
Right. Because the Laserdisc, the people who are into Laserdiscs, that is a whole cult, and it's mostly like Hollywood or like hardcore movie guys.
Well, because of Star Wars, right? It's kind of that drives it, because the PCM audio, it's just, oh man, it's such a boring conversation. But this is where
in my mind, I'm just remembering like the Amoeba in Los Angeles, like they have like a whole Laserdisc section, and they're all like crazy price, selling to like you know Hollywood guys. But I mean, that's also a place where I bought like a lot of used CDs because they have an extremely good used CD collection. And,
oh yeah, I went to
and like the
first
beautiful
place
thing
I
about
went.
them is like they will mark when something is from the 80s is a first edition or whatever, like an early edition. So it's like a pre remix, a pre remaster. into loudness war stuff. So like I have
Yep.
like a good example of that is I have like the first few, or like a solid chunk of the Cure catalog on CD in like in that era. Like the CDs are literally from the 80s, and they
Yeah,
sound great. They sound terrific.
that's a big one for me, which is and you're going to get a little bonus nugget that's not been in any of my Cure podcasts, buddy. The the weird thing about the Cure is it relates to Seymour Stein. So Seymour Stein, Sire Records, the guy who founded Sire Records, he knows something's going on in England, so he's flying over there because he's also an obsessive art collector. If you haven't read his book, it's phenomenal. Anyone who likes music needs to get Seymour Stein's autobiography. He goes over to England on behalf of Warner because Sire's already being sort of sub-imprinted by Warner Brothers. He signs Depeche Mode and The Cure. And then Warner's like, well, we can't spend all this money promoting to these, fringe English bands. You got to pick one. So he picks Depeche Mode. So the Cure ends up falling. He totally regrets this. He's like, this is one of my biggest mistakes. Like, I love Depeche Mode. They've made tons and tons of money, as much as the Cure, and they're friends. The Cure and Depeche Mode are hugely interlinked by the Beaumont family. But anyway, the point is, Seymour Stein goes over and he signs them. So for like 2 years, the Cure's hits are all on Sire, and their worst album, The Top. The key thing for the Loudness Wars is, prior to that, Chris Perry had done a deal with A&M. If you can find the A&M CD or vinyl of Happily Ever After, which is 17 Seconds and Faith packaged as one album set, those albums will never sound better than that. They never have, and nothing the Cure ever releases again will ever sound any good, because Robert Smith is a control freak and he's ruining all of their albums. And every time another remaster comes out, it's more painful than the one before it.
Yeah. I mean, the most beautiful 80s, I feel like, some of the best sounding CDs you'll get are all made in the 80s. They are recorded digitally, so it is a pure transfer. They're mastered to be CDs to take advantage of the unique qualities of CDs and the dynamic range offered by them.
The big one is Peter Gabriel's So. I mean, that's almost like a joke at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I think So is to early CDs what like Steely Dan's Asia would be to like 70s vinyl. It's
100%.
Like, this is a control record. You listen to this. Okay, that's how it should be. We can deviate this direction or the other, but this is like the standard.
If you put on the stereo system that I have that dates from this time, I also have a Nakamichi CD player, which I paid $0 for. It was given away at the dump. And this is the advantage of living in a like wealthy suburb. Like, I'm not loaded, man, but like I can dumpster dive from the loaded people. And I have this great stereo system that in total, I think it cost me, all of it together, including the Laserdisc player and the tape deck, were like, I think I have $250, including the speakers and all the units. But if you put on Red Rain on my system in my basement, I can't even tell you, Matthew, it is. And it's not just that. It's like you say, anything from this period, the way people's ears were tuned, they were tuned to vinyl, which means headroom. You don't brick wall it. The loudness thing doesn't come in until famously Oasis, really. And that no one looked at digital as a means to take advantage of raising or lowering, depending on how you talk about it, the headroom on a recording. They wanted to maintain, just like you say,
accuracy,
exact pinnacle accuracy to vinyl, because otherwise people are going to reject this format because it doesn't sound like what they're used to.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually looking directly in front of me at like some CDs, and like one of them is the PJ Harvey "Rid of Me," which a lot of people always complain about as being like, "Oh, that's recorded too quiet. I hate how quiet it is." Like, no, if you play, listen, I get that if you're listening to it a bunch amidst a bunch of other things on streaming or on a mixed CD, like whatever, that is annoying. But if you listen to that record the way it's meant to be heard, where you just put the CD on a decent system, like the loud stuff hits so much more effectively.
Oh my God. And that's Albini's whole thing, is headroom. Listen to Bedhead, listen to anything Albini's done, even In Utero, famously, right? Listen to all the Jesus Lizard records he did. He wants the sonic dynamics to be there. And the end of, that finale of Don't You Wish You Never Met Her, like, it's the Cure's 100 years to me. It is one of those primal, it's like the female inverse of that male rage. it's this incredible, the emotional dynamics of that song. You know, it's cheap as hell to talk about, you know, sexuality.
It's literally a whisper to a scream.
Oh yeah, yeah, it is. And but to me, it's also the gender. You know, it's sure, it's probably you know, a kind of heterosexual type dynamic, but it is so raw, man. That shit explodes in the finale in a way. Like, that was like a workout song for me, dude, for years. Like, if I was going running and I was feeling gassed, if I put on Rid of Me, it was just like, I'm back.